It's midday, Antietam, September 1862. The young man is face down in the middle of a cornfield. He's gripping the earth with his hands. He's biting down as hard as he can. There's pain running throughout his body. There's blood pouring out of him. As he's laying there, we can only think or guess what he's thinking about. But perhaps it's his children in those last waning moments of his life. His wife, his uncle, his mother, his father, his grandmother. But no matter what he's thinking about, he knows he's never going to be able to go back home. He'd almost predicted it just a few days before when he wrote a letter back home to his family. And as he lays there dying in that field, the one thing that he would probably regret is making a promise to his children that he'll come back home as soon as he can. Today we're going to hit up 3 major battlefields, or at least 3 locations that the Texas Brigade really started to get their reputation from. And along the way we're going to talk about a soldier that penned a letter that helps us paint that picture. He actually put details in his letter to kind of give us an idea of what it looked like to be a soldier on the ground at that time in Hood's brigade. We're going to go to Eltham's Landing, Seven Pines, and Gaines Mill to tell that story. Ultimately, the story ends at Antietam. Grenville L. Gage was a young man that had a family in Texas and out of Harris County. That's where he enlisted, at least. March of 1862 was the estimation of enlistment. He came out of a unit called Palmer Guards. The Palmer Guards became the 1st Texas. And here at Gaines Mill, this battle helped to cement not only their reputation, but the reputation of the Texas Brigade, Hood's brigade. It was one of those moments that stood out in time for one of those units. Just like there's always a moment for each unit, it seems, in the American Civil War when they're tested. Here, they were definitely tested. And Gage had a pretty good role here. He was just a regular soldier, just like all the others, but he fought and made it through this battle. And he would go on to pen a letter that would detail some of the events that unfolded for the first 3 real major events for the First Texas. In that letter, he talks about his family, and he talks to his family, really. He kind of almost says that he doesn't think he's going to make it. But at the same time, he says words that sound like he's very positive that maybe he'll get to come back home, which is his greatest fear, that he'll never get to see his family again. At least that's the way it seems in the letter. We'll never really know, because Gage didn't make it out of the war alive, and he didn't really write anything else past that letter. We hear a great many reports here about the war. Some think it will soon close, others think not. I cannot say myself. I have thought several times that the war was near a close. I cannot say when I will be home. They will not allow anyone a furlough who lives west of the Mississippi on account of the river being blockaded. You cannot imagine how glad I would be to see you all. While I write, the tears run down my cheeks. I want you all to pray for me. Oh, pray that I may be permitted to return to my family in peace. The first real engagement of Hood's men, the first Texas at least, happens right out here at a Civil War trail stop that's on the map. It's a place called the Battle of Eltham's Landing. It's the location right here. This location out here today may not look like much, but off in the directions behind me here, this was the battlefield known as Eltham's Landing in 1862. Stretching all the way out in this direction, all the way in this direction. Now, early in the morning, the Confederate cavalry were up on a high-rise, and they had their looking glasses out, and they could see thousands of Union soldiers disembarking off of boats and coming ashore, along with thousands of pieces of equipment and gear, cannons, and all kinds of things. Well, the Confederate Army, Johnston, knew that he had to do something about this because he was about to be flanked. So he ends up sending Whiting out here, who decides that the Texas Brigade was going to be taking the lead on this. Off to my right-hand side behind me, that's where Wade Hampton's going to end up. Directly in my front is where John Bell Hood is going to take his men. John Bell Hood decides to tell his soldiers to not put a round in, not load their guns. So they're carrying their guns, and they're coming across these fields, and Hood ends up on like a ridge just cresting above where he can see the soldiers down below. And he comes across a soldier from New York. That soldier's about 30 feet away from him, and he takes a bead on him. Well, Private John Deal disobeyed an order from his commanding officer. He had loaded a round in his gun. When that soldier took aim at John Bell Hood, John Deal lowered his rifle, shot just past John Bell Hood, and hits this soldier from New York and kills him instantly. He saved that general's life. There was never a mention of any disciplinary actions being held for John Deal. No doubt the 4th Texans were proud of John, and the 1st was out here with these Texans as well, fighting across these fields, trying to stop the flanking maneuver that was about to happen to this army. By 2 p.m., the fighting out here had subsided, and Whiting had decided to take his men back across these fields and head back to the main lines of Johnson at Barhamsville here in Virginia as they continue to make their way towards Richmond. Now, unfortunately for me, there's private property signs out here all over the place. Or I would probably be trekking about 2-3 miles in these woods just to see if I could even stand in the place where I think maybe John Bell Hood would have stood when he was almost killed. But I respect private property laws, so I will not be climbing out in the woods here where the private property signs are. This is a pretty historic place out here, though. And no doubt, Private Gage would have seen the action taking place out here. And this is why we think that in his letter he was describing, when he was describing the battles that he had seen, we think that one of those battles was definitely Eltham's Landing. This army, if you recall, was on the move from Williamsburg and Yorktown. They had suffered a defeat in Yorktown or in Williamsburg. They were stalemating out in Yorktown, and they were on the move to try to make their way back to Richmond and consolidate and protect the capital. At that time, McClellan was winning. He was forcing this army on the run, and he was making his way exactly where he wanted to go, to Richmond. But even though he outnumbered the Confederate army, in some instances 2-1, even though he had superior numbers, even though he had superior supplies, for some reason, General McClellan could not beat the forces underneath John Bell Hood, Robert E. Lee, Johnston, and ends up going back where he came. This is one of the biggest upsets during the American Civil War, because had he stopped it here, had he defeated the Confederate forces here in Richmond, the possibility of the war ending sooner would have probably happened. And just as Gage said, in his own words, they had been hearing words constantly throughout the war that the war was going to end, it was coming to a close. Unfortunately for Gage, it wouldn't come to a close. His war would end at Antietam. Out here on these waters, this is the place. It's called Eltham's Landing. And I'm just on the outskirts of the town called West Point. This was the place where those soldiers, those Union soldiers, came ashore as they were floating down the rivers here at the connecting point at West Point to try to go up and flank the Confederate Army headed towards Richmond. I don't have a pinpointed location as to where they came aboard, but coming out here, there is a park that is right off the side of the road near a bridge. We can actually get a good view of the water and the coastline out here at West Point. It's probably the most unobstructed view you're going to get, but it's definitely a beautiful spot to kind of imagine the ships as they're coming up the river and anchoring out here and having the soldiers come ashore with their weapons of war. I can only imagine what it must have looked like when those Confederate soldiers were on the ridge lines ahead of me over there, looking in this direction, realizing a powerful army was making its way towards them and probably going to flank them. Soldiers like Gage, Grenville Gage, he wouldn't have really known much because he was a private. He would have been in the ranks and he was being told what to do at all times. So he probably didn't know a whole lot about the soldiers moving in this direction towards him. However, when he took to those fields out there, when Texas took to the field, he got that bitter taste of war that him and his friends were craving for the first time, first real time, and saw that war machine that we're talking about here, saw it open up on him. No doubt, from that point on, the game was on, and the fight was definitely about to begin. There was no doubting that. On May 31st, 1862, the Confederates had been pushed back towards Richmond so far that they could have probably left and went home for breakfast. This place would become the stand that Johnson needed to take, as he had the Chickahominy between him and the Union Army, and he saw the opportunity to strike. So he sets his army up out here, and he fights. Now today, there's a Civil War Trails marker that's right smack dab in the heart of the fight, just down the road. And that's where you're going to find the story told on the sign. Here at this cemetery, Many soldiers that fought in and around Richmond for the Union Army are buried here in this cemetery. That fight at the time that took place here, Seven Pines, the Battle of Seven Pines, that Gage describes in his letter, where he's laying down on his face as shells are bursting above his head. That fight becomes the largest fight that happened in Virginia at that time during the American Civil War, up until that point. 70,000 men would fight, and 10,000 men would become casualties. The Union Army outnumbered the Confederate Army by 40,000 men, and yet still they were able to press and push the Union Army away. This was as close as McClellan would get to Richmond. This was as close as many of these Union soldiers laying here would get to Richmond. The fight would continue on, and Gage ultimately leaves here with the 1st Texas and makes his way to Gaines' Mill, where he sees his first real fight, his first contest, breaking those lines at Gaines' Mill with Hood's brigade. In the letter, Gage details laying down and shells bursting over his head. When he's talking about the shells bursting over his head, he's probably talking about Seven Pines. Because during that fight, Texas wasn't as actively engaged as most of the other units. Matter of fact, they were pretty much in reserve. And when you are in reserve and artillery is firing upon you, that's what you do. You get down flat to the earth and you just kind of lay there. You wait for it to be over with. Or you wait until the moment that the entire division has to run. And they didn't have to run. They continued to push forward. May 31st, 1862. The largest battle in Virginia up until that point was fought right here. This was Seven Pines. This place, the Williamsburg Road right over here. You can't see it today, but there used to be readouts, all kinds of earthworks out here, positions for cannons to be placed. 70,000 men fought out here. And more than 10,000 casualties happened out here along these streets and where these houses are. The battlefield swallowed up today. But after Eltham's landing, Gage ends up here at the Battle of Seven Pines. Now at this location here, you see behind me, there is a Civil War Trails sign. This is how you find the place, either that or the National Cemetery itself. But this takes you right to the heart of where the battle took place. You can see the sign, you can take a look at the map, and it'll kind of point you in the right direction. You'll have to visualize it for yourself because you go from country road after country road, and then you hit this little town. And the battlefield has been swallowed up. Out here, Johnson ends up being injured. And because of that injury, Robert E. Lee takes command. Out here, like we said about the letter, he did detail a fight where he was laying on his face and cannonballs were bursting above him. This is likely the battle he's talking about, because Texas did not really play a major part out here. They were in reserves. But it's a shame. This is what Seven Pines has turned into. Can't save them all, I guess.